Hey, we're back again on the brand new Painfully Honest Tech channel. First episode on the Painfully Honest Tech channel. This is the Painfully Honest Tech podcast. No, Painfully Honest Tech podcast channel.
It's a
Not
lot
to
of
be
painfully
confused
honest.
with the Painfully Honest Tech channel. So if you're here, you found us. And if you're not,
Surprise.
so so we've moved everything over to its own channel so we can we can promote the podcast all by itself and not have like all kinds of confusion about where does it live and why. So here we are. It is another week. It is the third week of March, I guess. And
Yep.
and we got snow overnight here in Iowa, which this is now the season where it's kind of like it's
It
not
doesn't know what
spring.
to do.
It's not spring yet in Iowa, but like you're kind of hoping, but you don't want to like speak it out loud because this can happen. Like suddenly
And didn't the
you just get.
groundhog go back in his hole and not see his shadow or whatever it means whenever it's going to be in early spring?
I don't know. I used like so Punxsutawney Phil is in Pennsylvania, and I grew up in West Virginia, which is right next to Pennsylvania. And even when we lived in New York, like that was a East Coast thing. So I felt like I heard about it more often, but I don't hear about it as often out here. And I can't remember if he sees a shadow, does
If he
that mean
sees a shadow and he runs back inside, it means 6 more weeks of winter. Or if he comes
yeah,
out, I think whatever. This is not the painfully honest weather podcast, but I think
yeah.
that he did not go back inside of his hole. So I thought they said that it was supposed to be an early spring, but I mean, who knows? Here the other day it was like 80, and then the next morning it was like 46, and then it's
Yeah,
back to 70 again. So whatever. I mean, it's just Houston.
yeah. And we kind of had the same thing over the previous couple of weeks where it would get up to like 60 something, but overnight it would get down to 30 something, which I don't mind that, but yeah, 4 inches of snow when you didn't know the snow was coming, not very fun. So, but yeah,
Probably
so
not as
we,
surprising as Apple getting sued, though.
uh, no, not at all. Nice transition there. First
Thank
thing
you.
we're going to talk about, obviously, since this just broke yesterday, you're probably hearing this on Saturday or sometime after that, so it would have been a couple of days ago. Apple has been sued for antitrust violations by the United States government, headed up by,
And like 16 states.
yeah, well, 16 states have signed on, but it's a
Yeah,
federal thing, right?
sure.
So under the Department of Justice, is under that umbrella is like all of this stuff. And Attorney
There's
General Merrick Garland, I just like to say his name because it's just like so weird. I don't know.
It is a really interesting name. I mean, especially when you put both of them together. I mean, Merrick on its own is interesting, and then you add Garland to it. I mean,
Yeah,
at least it's not whatever. I mean,
it
it's a
sounds
name.
fancy.
He comes from a different time. I mean, he's older than
Yeah.
both of us.
I'm at that age where I think that everybody like that should be older than me, but I don't know if he's that much older than me. So
I'm a
it's
well, wasn't he running for wasn't he a Supreme Court nominee like 20 years ago or
yes.
something? And
No, he
then
was a
that
Supreme. This was just back in the earlier part of, yeah, the earlier part of, it was either late Obama or early Biden. I can't remember, but he was up for Supreme Court justice
yeah, that
and
got
was
scuttlebutted.
yeah, he was not confirmed, which, given the people that that have been confirmed since then, I don't know, man. It's a I don't even want to get into that. We
Yeah, we
got
probably shouldn't. So Apple getting sued. Uh,
yeah,
so basically, they're being accused of basically, I guess, violating antitrust law. And we've seen this before with other companies. These companies, they get so big, basically antitrust laws are around to preserve competition and like the free market. And it's problematic when you get companies that are so big one, that they start basically gobbling up every like all the market share. So then there's no
Yeah.
competition. But then it's even more scrutinized when it's believed that they have policies or ways that they do business that further restrict competition, kind of keeping everything in their little nest egg, and then it makes it hard for other people to ever penetrate that market.
Well, and the interesting thing to me, I made a video about this yesterday, just kind of like, my first blush reactions to what they actually said in the press conference. I pulled some quotes from that. And the interesting thing to me is that on some level, they don't seem to understand like the way that this works. They don't understand. They were saying like, well, somebody could want to buy an Apple Watch, but they would have to buy an iPhone. It's like, no, I mean, the
Well,
Apple
I,
Watch
I was
is an
reading.
accessory of the for the iPhone, and
It
so,
is.
you
But
know,
I
you're
was
not.
reading some. I was reading some of the stuff, and they did use the Apple Watch as an illustration, where they're like, "Look, if you buy an Apple Watch, it makes it harder to leave Apple, but also like other watches don't work with Apple. Like you basically have to buy an Apple Watch, otherwise, like you can't use a smartwatch with an iPhone, or if you do, it's very limited. Or like,
Well, I haven't used one for a long time, but I know that. So now Garmin and those other sort of third party smartwatches, they all run on the Android operating system,
mhm.
but they always had their own bespoke app that you would get into. I guess one of the problems is that it's more difficult for some of these brands to attach themselves to Apple's, like the iPhone's health
Yeah,
information and stuff.
it can't access a lot of the things. So it makes it harder for programmers, and it makes it harder for businesses, and then it also, people just don't try because you can't do it, or you can't do it as well. So then, I mean, that's one of the things that they talk about whenever it's like it hurts competition because you can't compete.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess to me it's sort of like it's not a bug, it's a feature kind of thing. Like Apple's whole system is predicated on the fact that like they've built a system where all of these devices will work in concert with one another. And the only way that you can
Only if
do
you
that.
buy theirs, though.
But that's the thing, like, so it's the two different kinds of business models. So Apple has a very vertical business model
Hmm.
where, all the way from manufacturing all the way down to all of the products and all of the software, they have control over every aspect of it, right?
Hmm.
And so that gives them a lot more ability to control and sort of curate the experience that you get when using Apple devices.
Oh, there are
And
certainly benefits for Apple to do that, but it does also make it a lot more restrictive, and it makes it, and like when you have something that's like 60% of the market share and like 80% of all new sales, and then you have all this environment, like it's just slowly weeding out Android or any other alternatives, and it's slowly weeding out options for people to be able to use because it's so closed off that you can't really use anything with it. And if you buy it, you're basically stuck with it. I mean,
yeah, but see, my problem with that is like you're taking something that's like, to me, one of the biggest, most impressive features of Apple's growth over the past 20 years. The
mhm,
fact that they could build this ecosystem that, all of the different devices connect to one another and can do all this stuff.
mhm.
And then you're saying like, so
You've done your job too good.
yeah, it's like they created this awesome thing which now is like a bad thing because other companies can't do it. Or
Well, I have different thoughts on it. I mean, I get that. Okay, they've done such a good job. They've made such attractive products that they are. That's why they're good. That's why people want them. But at the same time, if you take a look at some of the other pleadings that they made, yeah, there are very obvious things that yes, it does limit competition. I mean, you can't even use another pay thing with the phone. You're stuck using Apple Pay. You look at Android, you can use Google Pay, Samsung Pay, whatever. So I mean, they limit payment methods that you can use. You can't really use other accessories with it. You don't get the same level of quality if you do use some other third party accessory or app with it. The market share is getting so large that it does restrict competition. And then because they have this veiled off conglomerate business and all these different things that they make, because it's not just phones now, it's phones, it's laptops, it's watches, it's tablet, and all of them take up so much market share that they can continue to raise prices because, well, there's no competition.
But
So
the thing is, like, I can see that argument. Like, that's a potential thing that they could do.
mhm,
But by and large, people talk about the Apple tax, right? And there are some Apple devices that are more expensive than their competition, but you could also, I mean, so you can buy a Pixel watch for 250 bucks
mhm,
and you can buy an Apple watch for 350 bucks, right?
mhm.
But that Apple watch is has more functionality, is better made, is like so like the materials are better. So it's like, okay, they've built a better product, which therefore, because of the material cost, et cetera, makes it more expensive. And so I think that,
I get that. I mean, we know about the Apple tax. I mean, and undeniably, their products typically work better. I mean, you take a look at the iPad, they basically created the tablet industry. You look at the Apple Watch, they basically created the watch industry. You look at the iPhone, it revolutionized and created the smartphone industry. So I mean, they have all these like leading edge products that created these categories.
right.
And we do talk about the Pixel Watch. It's an okay watch. I mean, I don't like it that much, but you can still use it with any other Android phone. So it's
Yeah.
not like, okay, yes, Google, the way they've done things, and they've done this partly because of the way Apple is. I mean, Apple would give anybody access, so you had to create something else. So
Well, but
fortunately,
so again, going back to like the business model. So Google's much a lot like Microsoft in that they created the software platform, right? And
well,
instead of,
I think they're also being sued too for their monopoly on search stuff. So
yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because technology is one of those things where like you could like one company can do a wildly better job than any of their competitors.
mhm.
And then you have to ask yourself like, so if they're Apple has the highest customer satisfaction rating of like any tech company in the world. Like
Mhm.
it's something like in the 85 to 90 something percent
Mhm.
customer satisfaction. And so I could see some places where so Android is the operating system and there are all these third-party manufacturers that make Android devices.
Mhm.
And that gives buyers choices, but it also arguably holds the whole thing back because without that ability to control what parts are being used and all that kind of stuff, like you have to build a much more dumbed down version of your operating
Well,
system, and and that's sort of what has hindered Android from being able to compete with Apple in some of these other areas of like, you know, Android tablets are nowhere near as satisfying an experience to use than an iPad. Samsung makes some nice
well,
ones.
I mean, I'll argue against that because I have both, and I prefer my Samsung one over my iPad. But for somebody who only uses Apple products, there's no question they're not going to go buy a Samsung tablet because it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
And that's, I think, part of it. And that's was another thing that I think they discussed in the suit that they filed because in addition to being anti-competitive, like they also really don't really upgrade or improve their devices that much. And that could be quite obviously seen between the iPhone 15, or the iPhone 14, the iPhone 13, the iPhone 12. Like, they're basically just giving us the same stinking thing year over year over year and still charging, $1,100 for it.
But the interesting thing is like, okay, now that the smartphone market has matured, like, so I just did my iPhone after 6 months review. I just filmed it before we started the podcast, and I was surprised as I went through and did, um, and pulled out like all of the quote unquote new features
Mhm.
and talked about them. That I was surprised that there actually is a lot of stuff that has been new or improved.
With the Pro,
But
yeah, with the 15 series this year, I will admit to that. Like, I have actually really enjoyed the 15 Pro Max.
but
Whereas, like, I was go ahead. Sorry, I won't cut you off.
well, over and above that though, like, it shouldn't it, who among who among the people who are on the outside looking in to Apple's process
Mhm.
has the overall say so about what's enough new features, enough this, that, or the other thing, right?
Well,
Because like it's
I'm
one of
sure they
the
take a snapshot at this stuff. I mean, and it's not one thing. I mean, this is not okay. We're Apple's being sued for one thing. I mean, they're talking about a lot of different things and keeping the ecosystem walled off. Other programmers can't make their stuff work for them. They can't. You can't use other accessories with the platform. They charge more money. They don't really upgrade stuff that much, and they keep making the same thing. The market share is so large, it's restricting competition. Like, when you look at all these things as a whole, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it deserves some scrutiny. I mean, I'm not saying Apple did anything wrong, and I don't think that Apple should necessarily, uh, be messed up with, jacked with, because they've done a good job. I mean, nobody can argue they haven't done a good job. I mean, they've made
right.
the hottest products that you can get in the tech world. But I think that I'm not saying that they need to be broken up. I'm not saying they need to be fined. I mean, I don't think there's any nefarious wrongdoing here, but I think that their platform should be a little bit more open for, hey, let some other third party payment apps use your stinking, work with iOS, or I know we're getting RCS, but I think they probably saw that coming. Like, I think they saw with all the stuff that's going on, that's probably why they said they're going to allow RCS to work with Apple, like, to try and appease people, because they've had
Yeah.
a lot of like, Europe's all over their nuts. I mean, they've already been forced to switch to USB-C, which, I mean, that alone, I mean, USB-C has been the standard for a decade.
USB-C, like the first major product to introduce USB-C, ironically enough, was the MacBook Pros, right?
Hmm.
Uh, I know that USB-C existed before that, but I mean, I think that most consumers probably were aware of it or encountered it with the MacBook Pros. And so that was 2016. So basically, we're looking at seven and a half, maybe 8 years of USB C, and Android switched over somewhere within a couple of 2 or 3 years of that to
I want to
USB
say
C.
that I want to say that maybe my first mainstream phone with USB-C was like the LG G3.
Yeah,
But anyway, that
that
that was like 10 years ago.
yeah, and but the thing is, like, when Apple introduced the Lightning connector and got rid of the 30-pin connector that had been around for so long,
Hmm.
Phil Schiller got on stage and said, this is like our revolutionary connector that's going to be our connector for the next 10 to 12 years.
Yeah, and
And
that's fine. I mean, that was their business plan, and they stuck to it. I mean, even
yeah,
though by the end it was obviously holding things back in a lot of areas, but I mean,
and that's the thing. Like, I try and take two different sides. I try and see what it looks like from the outside in. But then I try and look at it from the Apple product user's standpoint.
mhm.
I don't really think there were very many people using an iPhone complaining about not having USB-C. like they had a perfect, like Lightning was perfectly good unless you had a very niche specific need for higher bandwidth or something like that. Like it, nobody cared
Well,
inside of the Apple ecosystem.
everybody was happy and locked away inside their little ecosphere because, like, that it's also another way to keep people using a platform. And there's a lot of like they have a lot of practices that keep them on the platform. And I've been saying this for years. If you could use iMessage on another phone, they would lose like 25-30% of their customers. Like there are a lot of people that only use iPhone because they're stuck with iMessage, whether they like it or not.
See, I know there are a lot of people that say that, but I wonder if it came down to it, like, would you give up just because iMessage is now available on an Android phone? Would you go buy an Android phone if you've invested in the Apple ecosystem?
But it's about the singular only reason I have one, and I carry an iPhone as a secondary phone because of communication with my family, syncing group chats, and like all that crap. Like basically, I use one so I have access to Apple Pay, which because my kids use it, that's like my extension for them. Like they have their little Apple card with their spending limit, and if they need something, like I got to go approve purchases and stuff. But if it weren't for Apple Pay, and if it weren't for iMessage, I would never, ever, ever, ever carry an iPhone. Like,
See, but
so I
you
I would
also
be very
you also have to remember that like your vantage point is an incredibly privileged and very specific vantage point when it comes to this sort of milieu. Like you prefer Android and you
mhm.
would be all Android and all Android accessories. And if Android could do the things that Apple can do for you, you would never have anything to do with Apple. However, Android can't do those things.
Well,
And
Android can't do those things. The Android can do those things. They're actually quite simple things, but they're veiled off behind Apple. Like you can't use Apple Pay on an Android. I mean, you can use Google Pay, you can use Samsung Pay, you can use LG Pay, you can use like all these different payment methods. But Apple, you can only use Apple Pay, and you can't use it anywhere outside of your iPhone, so
but
or your Apple
uh,
Watch.
again, to me, that's like it's a feature, not a bug. Like the reason that LG Pay and Google Pay and Samsung Pay all exist is because there was no centralized place where they could go and say, okay, this is the standard we're all going to choose, right?
Right.
Because
Or
it
like
would be
a
much,
decade ago, there wasn't. I mean, there was MMS, and then they came up with. I mean, there was basically if you didn't use MMS, I mean, you had BlackBerry messages, you had BBM, which millions of people used back then. But yeah, they did create the standard, and I'm not faulting them for doing that. But whenever you and I'm not even saying they've done anything wrong. But whenever
yeah.
you look at it from an antitrust perspective, and then these things come up, like you have this ecosystem where people can't use this stuff outside their ecosystem. They can't leave. If you leave, you can't use this, you can't do that. And I get, yeah, it's a feature, not a bug. But whenever that feature becomes to take up 60, 70, 80% of the market, then it does make it where it's hard to compete because you can't go somewhere else and get in and do the same thing with your or have access to your stuff.
But this is where it gets confusing for me because I'm trying to figure out who they're trying to make it better for. Are they trying to make it better for the consumer? Because the consumer has chosen to go in this direction. Nobody forced anybody to buy an iPhone and
Right.
to get.
They didn't, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But as you've seen, and you look at the global market share, you look at the U.S. market share. They're not saying that what they're doing is evil. What they're saying is it's starving out competition, and it makes. I mean, because we're at 60% market share. Next year, it'll be 65. 10 years from now, it could be 90%, and then there's just no other feasible. It's you look at it. You look at Android. I mean, we've lost HTC. We've lost. I mean, Motorola got rebought out by Lenovo. We've lost BlackBerry. We've lost who else have we lost? We've lost all these different brands, and it just keeps dwindling and dwindling until at some point there's just well, you can get an iPhone or you can't do anything.
Which, I mean, I can see that as like a theoretical outcome, right?
Mm,
But I would say that two things are at play in the smartphone market, right? I would say that all of those companies you just mentioned were competing against other Android phone manufacturers first and
hmm
not iPhones, right? And as the Android marketplace sort of consolidated itself and LG and HTC and all these companies dropped off, that was like the product of Samsung being one of the biggest companies in the world and making 9,000 phones at every price point. And, you know, there's a lot that Samsung did to get their 18-20% of the marketplace.
Mhm.
But I would also say that in a capitalist society, in a laissez-faire capitalist society, right?
Mhm.
If that's what we are, then the company that builds the better mousetrap kind of deserves to put the other mousetraps out of business, right?
To an extent. I mean, I am very much hands off capitalist. I don't really believe that we should be regulating the way that everybody does business on such a level. But I do also think that, yeah, I think it's important to have competition, and whatever you there are very few instances where this happens. I mean, you look at Microsoft back in the 90s, we look at Apple now. I mean, you look at Google with their search stuff, and you have certain things that I don't think that it hurts Apple by allowing you to use iMessage or Apple Pay or your Google Watch, if you want to use an Apple phone. I mean,
Yeah.
you're if they're so good, if your product is so good and so amazing, it'll continue to sell itself anyway. I mean, but why are you shutting off access from programmers and developers just for simple features to connect another device to your phone?
So one thing that when it comes to the accessories, like Apple spent 3 years trying to develop an Android port for the Apple Watch, right? And ultimately, they couldn't create something that had the same functionality and was of the same quality, so they dropped it.
Hmm.
Um, Now, could you bring over a like a Pixel Watch? Should they allow that to happen? I guess so, but and I mean, well, why not? Like you say, if it's all better, nobody's buying a smartwatch because, like they said, you know, of a different styling. Nobody's buying a smart. Is any okay? Let me phrase it as a question: is anybody buying a smartwatch because of how it looks, or are they buying a smartwatch because of the feature set that it offers and how well it integrates with the other tech that they're using? Because the
Well,
smartwatch is not like a chronograph, right? A smartwatch is an accessory to your mobile device, right?
yes.
And so I would say that the majority of people would want the best integration possible. So Apple could, as you say, okay, you know, bring over like the the Android Watch app, and we'll let you sell watches to Apple customers. I don't know if it would make any difference. I
And it doesn't have to make a difference. And that's my argument. Like they even if like say let's say the federal government comes in and says you have to let people use iMessage on an Android, or you have to let people use Apple Pay on an Android, you have to let people use their third party accessories with your platform. Maybe it doesn't even move the needle, but at that point in time, you can't say that their restrictive business practices are stifling competition. The market itself is preserving that.
yeah, and I guess that like you only get to this point when one company does it so much better than its competition, right?
Hmm.
You only get to this point when one company has 70% of the market share.
Yeah.
And and so it's to me a good question to ask. I don't think they're asking honestly the right questions because if you really want to protect consumers, you should be looking at the people who have invested in the Apple ecosystem. I mean, I've been an Apple user for 30 plus years, right?
Hmm.
And so as an Apple user, I would love to be able to buy a MacBook and not have to pay 2 times the amount of money it would cost to upgrade storage or upgrade RAM from the market price. Like
Yeah.
if you can buy a 2 terabyte SSD off the shelf for $200,
Why am I
but
paying a grand for
you're
that?
pay you're paying $200 for going to one from
You
512
pay 2
gigabytes
you're
to a
paying
terabyte.
250 you pay 200 to go from 256 to 512, and then you pay another 200 to go from 512 to 1 terabyte. It's a $400 difference in what you could get 5 times as much storage for half the price if you go
Right.
buy it in the PC hardware world. So,
And
and I
so
think that's important. I mean, I think
to
it's
me
an
that's
important thing to talk about.
to me that's the more anti-consumer practice, in terms of like what is Apple doing to harm consumers. I mean, they've taken away, and I understand again, like with iMessage, I don't know if there's a technical way to produce iMessage that would go cross-platform and work the way that it should. I really don't know that, and the same way I know that the Apple Silicon systems on a chip, where the hard drive, where the system, the graphics, the RAM, all that stuff is all on one chip, and
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
it's
the
not,
unified memory.
and you can't like necessarily open the back and pop the RAM out and stick in more. I understand that because it's all one piece, right?
Mhm.
However, it seems like this Apple didn't start price gouging with MacBooks and iMacs and other things when they switched over to Apple Silicon and you couldn't do it.
Mhm.
They started taking the ability to do that away long
Before.
before that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
their reasoning was, well, it gives us the ability to make things smaller and do, technical things that we wouldn't be able to do if we had to guarantee that access. And I'm sure that that's the case, but it also helps them make a boatload of money,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know?
and I was talking about that. I made my Apple Vision Pro review finally last night. And
Right.
I was talking about some of the things that I don't like, and it's ridiculous to me that this thing is basically $3,600 plus tax, is 4 grand essentially for the base model, and it starts with 256 gigabytes of storage. Like, in what world does a $4,000 computer that's supposed to revolutionize spatial computing in the year 2024 come with 256 gigabytes of storage?
So the only counter to that I have, because I thought about the same thing, and I thought about it before I had Vision Pro, and then after using Vision Pro, I was kind of like, okay, so well, nothing actually at this point, nothing actually lives on the Vision Pro that's going to take up a huge amount of storage, right?
Yet, but I
So,
mean, we're 3 months into its like life cycle.
but this is also this is where iCloud comes into its own, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's already much better than it was when it first came out in terms of the mobile devices, in terms of, being able to offload things from your computer to iCloud. I think iCloud is a very misunderstood cloud service,
Mhm.
which I think that Apple wanted it to work like Dropbox, right? And Apple actually tried to buy Dropbox, and Dropbox said no.
Mhm.
And Steve Jobs couldn't move them off their spot. So they couldn't buy Dropbox. They had to come up with something else. And ultimately, it developed into iCloud. But I don't think Apple really ever taught people how to use iCloud. So I have 2 terabytes of storage that
Mhm.
I can use on iCloud. So theoretically, I have a 512 gigabyte hard drive on my computer, right? But I don't need to store all of those things on all the stuff that I have. I don't need to store all at once on my computer. So whatever, if I store it in my iCloud folder, or if I put my documents folder or anything else like that up on in my iCloud, then that stuff is like up there and accessible, but not taking up your hard drive space.
Well,
So
I think when it comes to iCloud, it's not so much a lack of education. I think the vision for iCloud exceeded what its capabilities were technologically because of the like inherent like we needed 5G. We needed
right,
really like we needed robust 4G LTE. We needed Wi-Fi 6. I think that what its vision was at the time it came out, it didn't live up to it until the methods got there because it's very
right,
seamless. And you take a
yeah,
photo and bam, that sucker's on the cloud. You get a document, and you create it. Bam, that sucker's on the cloud. You download a video. I mean, I
Yeah,
recorded my video last night. I had edited it, and as soon as it created the new file, it was halfway uploaded to the cloud by the time I went to go upload it to YouTube.
yeah,
And so now it does. Yeah, I mean, I get that. But when you take a look at the price of what actual storage media cost, so
yeah.
Apple's charging you $200 to go from 256 to 512. In
Yeah.
reality, it's costing them $1.
And the thing is, like, it gets even worse with stuff like, well, y- some of the Apple devices top out at 2 terabytes as the maximum storage they can have. So
Hmm.
you can get 8 terabytes on a MacBook Pro, and
Hmm.
8 terabytes is going to cost you $4,000 or something
Yeah,
ridiculous.
it's ridiculous.
And the thing is, like, you could buy an 8 terabyte SSD and it's nowhere near that price. So I mean, when it comes to antitrust and protecting consumers and all that kind of stuff, I mean, I made my video and people were, there were some negative comments about how, I was showing my Apple sheepishness by defending them against these claims. To me, like, a lot of the claims that are being made, Apple has already sort of like made moves toward addressing some of those things. I mean, I think
Hmm.
taking allowing RCS to, bringing RCS onto their platform, uh, is probably the best move that they can make
Hmm.
in terms of giving Android users a similar experience to what an Apple to Apple iMessage user would have,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I,
Because
I agree. I think, and like I said earlier, I think Apple has, yeah, they've already done some things. And I think they did that in anticipation. Like somebody might have tipped them off because yeah, they have been trying, like people have been trying to find ways around this for a long time. And then all of a sudden, okay, we're going to give it this year. And then magically they get sued like 3 months later. So I think somebody probably tipped them off. They maybe saw the writing on the wall, but I don't see these as being bad things. And if you, I mean, some of these things, like I said, if we can open up and get behind this veil for developers and allow apps to be made on Android to access iCloud, or at least in a rudimentary, like just to be able to get your files, right? I don't expect the same level of like utilitarianism whenever it comes to
so
both of them,
yeah, I
but
mean,
just to be able to get the
you can do
files.
that. You can get iCloud for Windows. So
Hmm.
I could, and Apple has gone that far. And they had to do
Yeah.
this with the iPod too, because basically to use an iPod when they first came out, and this was the limitation of, new technology more than anything else, you had to have an Apple device to
Hmm.
plug your iPod into, right?
Hmm.
So that was a big issue, and Apple, after a few years developed the Windows version.
Hmm.
And they've developed Windows versions of a lot of things like iCloud,
Or
iTunes, et
like
cetera, et
something as
cetera.
far as giving us the opportunity to just use nearby share or AirDrop on it, like on an Android device to send something to your Mac. I mean, I see. Here's another instance. I can't send crap from my Android phones to my Mac. Now, if I could, I mean, that would be great because I like to use Android phones, but I prefer a Mac computer for my editing. I do all my work on a Mac computer. So, like,
Yeah.
that's good, but it's like, oh, try sending something from an Android phone. So,
I mean, ultimately what I end up doing, and it's not nearly as like quick and easy, but if I've got video footage or audio footage, I just upload it to Google Drive or
and that's
Google
what I do
Photos, and
too.
yeah.
But it's just another illustration. I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah.
little like there are certain things they could do that I don't think would hurt their platform. That would, I think, satisfy this whole antitrust thing and also make it more convenient for consumers, even if it doesn't move the peg on the market share. Like that's not the biggest thing to me, but it gives people choice, and I think it makes things a little bit more accessible.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I get it. Um and like I say, I see anti-consumer practices that Apple has, and usually those anti-consumer practices are more sort of negative for their current customer base than they are for anybody else.
Hmm.
Like they got sued in a class action suit for slowing down iPhones.
Yeah.
They say they had a good reason for it, and, again, the reason that they gave for slowing down iPhones, like trying to preserve battery, trying not to, give you a little bit better lifespan on your phone,
Mhm.
that would be a byproduct of slowing down the phone, right?
Mhm.
But also, like, you slow down the phone and people
Makes
think I
people
need
wanna
a
go
new
buy a new
phone.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. S
So, but again, see, this is where Apple gets kind of like Apple supports their iPhones for 5 to 6 years of, like, operating system updates. So, on one hand, they're very consumer friendly in the sense that, like, you can use your iPhone forever,
Well, they also
and
I think they do drive competition in certain ways. I mean, you look at how Android has adopted this and moved and, like, they've matured
yeah.
over the last few years. Samsung is now offering 7 years of support. Google is now offering 7 years of support. I guarantee you if Apple wasn't supporting their products for 6 or 7 years, that Google and Samsung wouldn't be doing this. So, I mean, there
Well,
are ways that
yeah.
they do help drive competition too. So, I don't think I mean, I think Apple's evil. But I don't think they're necessarily evil because the market has coalesced around them. They made a good product. If you look back 25 years ago, they were basically bankrupt, 30 or
Yeah.
whatever it was. And
Yeah,
Windows,
the
like,
mid-80s, yeah.
yeah, or I thought it was the 90s, but yeah, whatever. Bill Gates gave them money from Microsoft to keep them alive, and then now they're like the biggest company in the world. So even though in the face of having overwhelming market share, like you look at Windows, Windows basically has in the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, it was completely everything was Windows, and that's why they got sued. I can only envision Elon Musk in the next 10 years getting sued for having a monopoly on EVs. But I
Yeah,
mean,
well,
when you start and you create a market, and then the demand is there, and you're making the best product, yeah, you're going to jump way out in front of everyone. It's going to be hard to catch up, but that's just there's cycles in the market. I mean, 10 years from now, we may not even be talking about Apple. We could be talking about something else. So, I mean, despite the best practices and despite best efforts and trying to be and maintain being the best, at some point in time, you're going to get passed up. So, I mean, I think there's a very fine line. You don't want to stifle competition. You don't want to be like necessarily penalizing these brands if there's no obvious indications of wrongdoing. But I think there is certain things in the market that once you get a company that's so big that yeah, it definitely can stifle competition, and it makes it difficult for people to move back and forth freely between platforms.
yeah, which, I mean, the flip side of that is, again, like, I think people that choose the Apple ecosystem choose it for
For a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons.
yeah, and so the one thing that's interesting to me is that, like you said, Steve Jobs had been fired, and John Scully came in and was the CEO of the company, and they made some moves that didn't end up working out, and that's part of the reason that they were in such a dire place. And one of the decisions that they made was to license Mac OS to third-party companies so third-party companies could make hardware,
Hmm.
and the hardware that the third company parties made was so inferior to the Apple hardware that nobody bought that stuff, and I mean, it just dug them a deeper hole.
Well, I
So,
do think that I think they've learned from that too, and I think that's been
yeah,
part of their like only our hardware mantra for a long time. I mean, it makes sense, and it's so deeply ingrained in all of their hardware now that it that experience could not be replicated by anybody else. Like nobody
and it
else could make a chip that's going to do exactly the same thing as an M3 if you put Mac OS on it. Like it's just not going to happen.
right,
And I mean, they've been moving away from this for years. And it's funny because for the while, Intel was powering it was powering some Mac computers. It was doing a pretty good, darn good job. But then they're like, okay, we can do this better. And now they, have
yeah,
it's just another thing. Like it's and that's great. They've been if it wasn't for the M1 chip, we wouldn't have all this development from Qualcomm in the ARM department.
yeah,
So, I mean, there are a lot of things they do that definitely do drive competition. But I think what a lot of it comes down to, like you said, maybe some predatory practices that allow them to do that because there's no real alternative that does what they do. So they can charge you $400 for a terabyte of storage.
yeah.
So, I mean,
Which to me, like, so I've tried multiple times to leave Apple and go over to Windows, Android, whatever. And I mean, it's well documented on my channel over a bunch of years now. I try and I fail because I like I've become so invested in the Apple ecosystem, not just monetarily, but in terms of like how I work, what my workflow is, what I expect from my hardware, what I expect from my software. And, all of that has been influenced by my experience with the Apple devices, right? And
It is.
when Steve Jobs came back to, um, when Steve Jobs came back to Apple and John Scully got fired, like things were happening. Like the Newton was like John Scully's big product. Huge failure, maybe ahead of its time, because PDAs, had their moment years, a few years later. But
Mhm.
Steve Jobs, like the idea that he always said that he had for Apple was he wanted to make computers that were simple enough that anybody could use them and they could become sort of like household appliances, you know? And that was he re-embraced those ideas, started developing the iMac, started developing the clamshell MacBooks, simplified the products that they were offering,
Mhm.
and then built like first a strong user base from the computer side, and then in 2001, yeah, 2001, here comes the iPod, you know, and
But you also have to look at other things too. Like, yeah, the iMac and like the G3s, everybody loved that stuff. But would they have been successful if you couldn't use Microsoft Office Suite or have Microsoft Office Suite compatibility on a Mac? Like,
and that,
would they have been
and
able to compete as well with the PCs?
well, and that's the thing. Like, I feel like I feel like it's kind of it can become a kind of slippery slope argument because yes, there were Mac specific business applications, right?
Hmm.
WordPerfect, things like that. Like they were there and people used them, but as Microsoft Office became established as the standard across pretty much every business in the world, that
Hmm.
that office the Office suite became the standard. And when you look at stuff like graphic design, the what has now become the Adobe suite,
Hmm.
that was a bunch of different products that came under the Adobe umbrella. But Apple had to allow for some things to come in,
Hmm.
and I think that was driven by market forces, right?
Hmm.
If Apple had those programs in their walled garden
Hmm.
that people would choose over the outside programs, then we'd be in the same place, right?
But
But
you have to have choice, and that like yeah, sometimes the market will drive these things, and that's you have to be very careful when you deal with these antitrust lawsuits because the effect you want is to maintain competition and free market. You don't want to stifle those things. And if you start suing everybody who has a successful product because everybody else can't use it, then you're going to stifle competition because people are like, why
right,
am I going to do this if the federal government is just going to take it away from me for doing a good job? So, like, you have to have a very, like, it's a very, very, very thin line there. And like I said, yeah, the market forces, yeah, people adopted Adobe and then Adobe was made available on other platforms. But and that's sometimes companies don't do that on their own though. And that's when
right.
the federal government's like, okay, we've got so many things here that we believe. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I am just I read what they put out there. I looked at the reasoning for why. I can see it, but I'm not saying that necessarily. And that's the other thing too. You can have things. The market itself may have created this problem. So I'm not saying it's inherently Apple has done something wrong. And a lot of people look at it and they want to assign right or wrong. But it's not right or wrong. It's about what's best for the market and the consumer.
At the end of the day, like I think it's really important to make the point that so what we're talking about in terms of antitrust law is the Sherman Act, right? And I
Mhm.
think the Sherman Act is only like been invoked, what, like 3 times
Yeah,
in
it's only been used 2 times.
the 100 plus years that it's been a thing,
Mhm.
and the most recent being when, uh, Bell Telephone, AT&T got split up into
3 different companies, I
separate
think.
I think it was like Singular and AT&T and, um,
There
I
was a whole
forget what
yeah, there's
and
I can't remember what
and
it's called.
that was just that was just based on the fact that Bell Telephone created at least created the telephone and successfully created a pathway toward placing them in people's homes, right?
Yeah,
And then as telephones became not necessarily a luxury item and
a
not
commodity.
necessarily it becomes a commodity that every household has and every household needs.
Mhm,
Um, Bell Telephone, they had so much of the marketplace that there was no price competition, and so they could basically charge whatever they wanted,
mhm.
and it was I mean even when this was when I was really young, but even as a young person seeing that like they owned all of the telecommunications in the US, like I
Yeah,
could see that was anti-competitive, you know? So it made sense, and I think it spurred a lot of technological leaps forward in terms of the cellular industry. And now these companies are competing for customers, and they want to have more and more features and more and more offerings. So I think that had its right outcome.
mhm.
And where I start to think about how that would apply to Apple, like I it wouldn't be the same thing, because at when I when I think about, are there choices other than Apple for your smartphone needs, for your computing needs, for are there other choices? Yes. Has Apple created a I guess like you could potentially look at the Apple ecosystem as being somewhat trapping the users without being able to leave um, easily. They've got so
Mhm.
much money sunk into the ecosystem. I can see that, but I can't. What I can't see is how breaking up or like infringing upon Apple's current business model would would I guess like would spur competition and
Well, I
like
think we
that's
have
what I can't see.
I don't see there being any need to break them up. I don't think we need to separate it like, whatever it was, Microsoft was split up back in the 90s with their 2 divisions. I don't think this is something but you made an interesting, correlation. You talked about Bell, and basically they were it, right? They
Yeah.
were the standard. They were it was either you have a Bell telephone, you have Bell, or you don't have nothing.
Yeah, so
And
like you're paying AT&T or Bell Telephone
yeah,
for your service, and they're giving you your phone, and there's like you don't have any other choice.
it would be like if we only had Verizon. And everybody knows Verizon's expensive. They charge more than everybody else, but it would be like that. So that's kind of the modern day equation. If there was no other cell phone carriers and you only had Verizon, and
Right.
that's one of the reasons why it was important. We had Sprint, we had T-Mobile, we got these other companies that came online to give us competition because otherwise we would still be paying those high prices. Well, if you look at Apple, yeah, right now where they're at, they're positioned that way. I mean, it's if you look at it from a more modern perspective, you look at the iPhone, you look at the market share, you look at the market share on the Apple Watch, you look at the market share on the iPad. It's like you basically have an Apple Watch or you don't have one. You basically have an iPad or you don't have one. If
Right.
you want to use Apple, so I don't see. I mean, I can see how there's a correlation there. And if we look at this, let's say 5 years from now, it's only going to be worse
Yeah.
because nothing else can compete with them in their own environment.
And and th- I would say that that was a better, like, you could make a better case for that, say, in 2017, when there were two models of the iPhone, and that was your choice. Like, you
Mhm.
either get the big one or the smaller one, and they control the price, they control the access, et cetera, et cetera. But over the ensuing years, Apple has introduced models of the iPhone that run the gamut of price range from 1,500 to $500, right?
Mhm.
So that offers more choice. I realize that it's not one of the things that they're pointing out in this particular case, but
Well, you
they
could even argue though that they did that to attract even more customers in their
well they did.
platform to lock them
They
in.
did.
Yeah, because people couldn't afford them. So now we're like, "Oh, we've
People
got this iPhone SE you can get for $400 and you can get all the advantages of our great ecosphere." And then, okay, they buy it. The phone gets supported for 5 or 6 years, which is great. I'm not faulting them for that. But you can look at all these practices and you combine them together to say that, yeah, they want to attract more customers in to increase their base, which further locks in even more people.
yeah.
And
And you could I mean, the reasoning behind that obviously would be, well, people aren't buying the iPhone because it's more expensive, and so therefore
it's
they
cost prohibitive.
buy an Android phone,
Mhm.
right? Because I mean, these days, especially, you can get a decent Android phone for 200-300 bucks, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, but I have no idea what percentage, but some percentage of consumers out there would have preferred to buy an iPhone but couldn't afford it. And
Yeah, for sure.
when it became more affordable, they bought the iPhone,
And
right?
I'm not saying that's necessarily even predatory. That would be stupid to look out there and say, "How can we get these people?" If you're a business owner, you don't look at this and go, "Okay, how can we make this fair but still get more people to come here?" I mean, you
Right,
just want to make the best product and you want people to buy into your product.
right.
So, I mean, it makes sense. You don't have to make that decision. You don't have to look at it when you do that. When you look at it is whenever it's very obvious that you have this giant company that's created a platform that's like it was at 50%, and it's 60%, 70%. Like it's just we have so much. I mean, this is a uniquely US thing too, because if you still look globally, the Android and Apple like market shares is much more there's much more parity, but you also have to look at the US where we're a very large first world country. Apple is from here. The way things are built, like more people can afford $1,000 iPhone in the US than you can in the Philippines or you
Yeah,
can in Indonesia. So that's where Android in India is going to have a much larger share because you can get an Android phone there for $100. If you want to try and have an iPhone imported, you're going to be paying like twice as much money. You'll be paying two
right.
grand for an iPhone. So I mean, there are reasons why this is a uniquely U.S. issue so much as it being an international issue.
But the interesting thing is, globally, in 2023, out of the top 10 selling phones, 7 of them were iPhones.
Yeah, I saw that too.
and and they weren't like, so iPhone 15, 15
No,
Pro, 15 Pro Max,
14,
14,
13.
14 SE, like all their current models were in there.
Mhm.
And so, to me, that says, that used to be the thing that everybody would argue about. It's like, well, it's just a US thing. And I think it's still true that people in the US care about iMessage
Mhm.
because it it
Every time we
developed
have this Every time we have this iMessage argument, there's always our European friends who are like,
who are
"Why do
like,
you
well,
care
we
so much
don't
for that?
care.
We use WhatsApp."
Well, the reason that we care is that you have to remember that iMessage was built to solve a problem. That problem was,
SMS.
yeah, being able to send more than however many characters you could send in one SMS message. I like, it was a very truncated, very legacy, very frustrating technology, and it was all that was available. So Apple created their own solution.
Oh yeah,
And
if
when
you
they
and also another thing a lot of people don't understand is how much more advanced cellular technology was outside of the US. Like we were very, very slow to adopt things like 2G and 3G. We're very slow to adopt other transmission methods and or bring in other ways to communicate.
right,
Whereas like a lot of these things developed outside the US. So we're sitting
yeah,
here with our our old CDMA network on Verizon and our Sprint. We're sitting here with our character limits on SMS and everybody else. I was in Japan in 2004 and people were doing video calls on their stinking Vodaphones. So I'm
Yeah.
like, we were way behind. So iMessage did solve a problem. The problem is that now iMessage has become basically the standard.
And that's the thing. I mean, I always go back and forth between saying, yeah, I understand that from the outside looking in, but I also understand it from the inside looking out, in the sense that, like, it's it's become that way because it works so well, right?
Hmm.
And part of the reason that it works so well is because it's a first party application that works on first party
It does.
hardware.
But there's also an argument to be made because Apple does everything on their own. Just because Apple does everything on their own doesn't mean it's the best. I mean, there are other security standards out there. There are other standards out there that may be even higher than Apple's, but Apple will never use them because they want to use their own stuff. So, I mean, just because it works doesn't necessarily mean it may be the best, which that's even very low down on the totem pole. But I go back when I look at iMessage and you talk about, we looked at Bell, we looked at how they basically turn something into a commodity and it turned into basically our way of life for communication. It was the standard for communication. A telephone was the standard for communication. Now, 80% of the standard for communication in the United States is iMessage. So if you look at standards for communication, nobody's saying you have to have Apple. Nobody's saying you have to have iMessage on an Android. They're just saying you need to be able to communicate on the same level. And I get it.
Right.
They've already said they're going to adopt RCS, but if they hadn't made that announcement 4 months ago, we'd still be saying, yes, obviously they need to do this. So that
Yeah.
would be part of this conversation.
Yeah. No, I get that, and it does make sense, and I do understand. You know, I think the frustrating part of it has always been MMS and SMS have always been an inferior standard, right? And because iMessage uses Wi-Fi signals to, I don't know exactly what all the details are, but because it uses Wi-Fi and connects devices differently,
Hmm.
it's been able to access more bandwidth that's on better quality pictures and videos and that kind of thing. So it was a problem that Apple solved for themselves that wasn't solved by other companies or the mobile carriers, for that matter,
Well,
for
I think
years and years and years.
that's where you look at the telecommunications, and that's you look at the government and the FCC and how they do things, and it's like, no, SMS is good enough. It's like, okay, it reminds me of whenever we got rid of analog TV signal and we went to HD TV signal for your antenna if you happen to have one. Like, the government is very slow to raise the bar on certain
Yeah.
things, and I just don't think there was much investment there because there wasn't a need. But it's like you look at now, they finally had legislation the other day where they're like, okay, we're going to make the minimum standard for internet connection is going to be 100 megabits per second. I'm like,
Instead of
thank you.
60. Yeah.
It's 50 or whatever it was. So I'm like,
Yeah.
the government is very slow to actually update the minimum standards.
And
And
and I
like,
think I think part of that is because one thing that I think, there are only a few countries in the world that would understand the scale, right? China, Russia, United States, in terms of overall scale and size, like massive, like any kind of change to anything that is like a ubiquitous a ubiquitous commodity like television signal, right?
mhm.
Think about how bigger a logistical nightmare it would be here as opposed to England, which, England can fit inside of Texas.
Like five
So
times.
so it's kind of like, okay, if you're smaller, you have more freedom to move around. You have more ability to act more quickly. But, bigger boats take longer to turn.
Well,
That's just
we have a lot of unique problems in the United States, like trying to get fiber everywhere. It's much easier to get fiber when you're this big, whenever you're talking, like, as opposed to the entire United States, which you've got you've got desert, you've got uninhabited areas, you've got
You got
the mountainous areas,
mountains.
you've got we have all of these things, and we're like massive.
Yeah.
So and that's why sometimes you look at like state by state. Some states do things a little bit better, but as far as like a national solution, yeah, it's a lot easier whenever you're the size of Spain, you're the size of England, as opposed to this, and like that's just geographically how everything works out. It's not really a like nationalism problem as much as a geographic restriction.
Well, and it's interesting as because I was recently listening to an audiobook by Bill Bryson called Home. And it's a book that's basically about the history of the modern home and how it came to be that. And one of the things that he ended up talking about was problems that were unique to the colonies and then the states that weren't problems in Europe. One of which being
Freezing to
when
death.
one of which being freezing to death. But whenever the United States, the 13 colonies were settled, they were all east of the Appalachian Mountains, right?
Yep.
And the Appalachian Mountain Range goes from North Carolina to Maine.
Yeah, it
And
goes way up there.
it became a real issue in terms of being able to get goods across, like once trains came into being and stuff like that, like there wasn't the technology to get this stuff over the mountains without like great expense
Or
of
people
both,
dying.
and so they came up with the Erie Canal.
Mm.
And because prior to the Erie Canal, uh some of the, like, New Orleans and some of the other, Charleston, South Carolina, some of these more southern states with ports were busier ports than like New York or Boston.
Oh yeah.
And so the
Yeah,
state
everything.
of New York, because you
Well,
had, like, if you took stuff into New York and wanted to get it to the west, like you couldn't just put a boat on the Mississippi River and float it up, right? You had to cross those mountains.
well, we run into this problem like even now with with colonization. Things don't exist when you get there. So it's like when we everything used to have to come to ports. It would have to come to Philadelphia. It would have to come to Boston. It would have to come to New Orleans, and then it would get distributed into the interior because all the manufacturing and all the goods were across the ocean.
Right. Right.
So
And
so
so
it's
I mean, the Erie Canal is kind of an interesting analog to iMessage, in the sense that, like, the state of New York recognized that they needed to solve a problem, right? Getting stuff to the west without having to traverse mountains. So they
mhm,
came up with their own solution of building this canal. A canal in that scale had never been built in the history of man.
mhm. Yeah,
And so they figured out how to do it. And now you've got the Erie Canal at the top of the Hudson River that can take you out to Lake Erie and put you into the Great Lakes, which then puts you over to Chicago, which then gives you access to the interior of the
Midwest.
country,
Yep.
right? And so it solved a problem, just like iMessage solved a problem. And now it's not as big a problem because we can drive things there. We can fly things there. We still use trains to take stuff. But, water was the easiest way to transport things in that at that time. So that's this ultimately, and I think we've probably we've probably beaten this horse to death enough at this point. Um, but ultimately, what always happens when there's a new technology, whenever there's a new problem to be solved, right, is that someone will solve that problem.
Mhm.
And then, depending on how successful they are at solving that problem, like, they may become much more powerful than the other people who had a different solution, or didn't have any solution, right?
Mhm.
I think about, like, electricity. When the United States, is like DC or AC or DC, and Nikola Tesla's solution was much better in terms of, like, amount of power that could be created, et cetera, et cetera. It was way more dangerous, but you know, but
Yeah,
I mean, in terms of like all the measurements that you could make, it was it was a better solution. But um, AC won the day, right?
that's a lot better
And
than not killing people.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely it's. I just I just imagine like DC coming into your house would be a lot more frightening than but
Yeah, yeah, my home insurance would be a lot more expensive.
yeah, but like so now we come to this place where we're up against one set of American values, which is the that sort of like manifest destiny, like go out there and be the best thing that you can be, laissez-faire capitalist society that the market wins the day, whatever, the better mousetrap is what ends up being the thing, but it
Just
comes
don't do
up
it so good
against
other people can't do
right. Right.
it.
So then this becomes like then the regulatory body comes in and says like, "Oh, you're too good.
Yeah, you're too good.
You're making this mousetrap too trappy."
Right, other people have to play on the playground.
Yeah. And so I guess it's good that we have these conversations, and I guess it's good that like when changes need to be made, we have a mechanism by which to make the changes. Um, because wasn't it Standard Oil that also got broken up? Wasn't it the first Sherman Act
I don't remember.
case? I think it was, and basically like what it what I remember, and of course this might not be 100% correct, is that Standard Oil had bought up all the little oil companies that had popped up around Pennsylvania and down in Texas and other places where oil was being refined. And after a certain, because there was an oil boom and then an oil
It was
bust,
bot. Yeah.
like, really, really quickly, like within 10 years. So Standard Oil was able to come in and just buy everything. And that gave them basically a monopoly on the oil supply in the United States. So I if I'm wrong about this, I'll take it out. but I think this
I
is like the
I think yeah, I think it's in the same vein. I think people understand what we're trying to get at, and
yeah,
I think we probably talked this one to death. I think we've reached a logical stopping point
yeah.
on
The funny
the
thing is
Apple.
though, we now only have two oil companies. So we went from one to many back to two. So
Yeah, yeah, it reminds me like it's yeah,
yeah,
it's funny.
but same thing with media. Uh, you know, Clear Channel Media. Anyway, yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic, and I think a lot of times when I talk about stuff like this, people are like, "Oh, well, Jason's like all about Apple." It's like, well, I mean, I might have a bias toward Apple because that's what I use the majority of the time. However, I just think like intellectually, this whole idea is really interesting to discuss because it does like have that friction point at like two points of our moral compass as a country. And so yeah. But yeah, we talked about that for about an hour and 10 minutes or so.
Very healthy topic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
That
we
was
could,
good though. It was good. It was good talk.
yeah, no, I agree. I think this is something that will continue to be discussed. Um, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. If the Department of Justice has actually understands what they're talking about and has chosen the right things to focus on. Um, again, which I don't know. I don't know that they have, but it is what it is. It'll go from here. Um, yeah. So that's going to be the podcast for this week, I guess.
Hopefully
Um,
enjoyed it.
yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks. Yeah, let us know what kind of questions you have down in the comments, and we'll address some of those. Maybe we'll address some of them later next week because obviously, like this is a brand new thing, and we can't think of every angle by which to approach this. So yeah, let us know what you think down in the comments, and thanks for being here. if you're brand new to the new channel, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so that you can get notified. Hit that notification bell. Get notified when the podcast comes out. Um, and we'll be back again next week to talk about something else. So,
Yes.
once again, my name is Jason. This is Adam from the Tech Odyssey. This is the Painfully Honest Tech Podcast. The podcast so honest it hurts. Until the next time, we're out.